Hello and welcome to Red's Business and Technology Podcast. I'm your host, Jackson Barnes.
And your co-host, Nigel Heyn.
And today we're sitting down with Lani Refiti, who's an expert in everything in emerging technologies and cybersecurity. Should be an exciting episode. We're going to discuss cybersecurity, Chat GPT, AI, and what's next for Lani. Mate, thanks for coming in. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on. And can I commend you on the setup and the offices, etc. So thanks for having me on.
No problems at all. Mate, Lani, let's start with your background before we get to what you're doing now.
Yeah.
Roll way back to your first foray into technology and cybersecurity. Let's start there.
But Jackson, that's going to give up my age, mate. So I've been in cyber before it was cyber. In fact, it's funny. I was talking to someone over the break and said, hey, you know what? New Year's resolution, how about we don't call it cyber anymore because it's, information security or data security. But I've broken that already, so let's go with that. So I've been in cyber for about 25 years, which probably gives away, as I said, my age. But yeah, 25 years in cyber, emerging tech as well. So worked for a lot of technology vendors, Intel Corporation, Cisco, some of the consulting firms as well. So I was at PwC, a partner at Deloitte for a while, looking after their smart cities practice. And at the moment, I'm a partner at a venture capital firm called Azcende.
Okay.
But throughout those 25 years, always in technology, business technology. I've always said that technology is great, tech is great. I mean, I love my gadgets like everyone else, but it's the actual people element that make it really interesting. Without that people element, it's for naught, right? And so back in 2015, I did my master's in psychotherapy. So I've got a master's in psychotherapy. I practice as a therapist, as a volunteer. I don't have my own private practice. So I practice at our local community centre. So I see a lot of people, with what I call the worried well. So they've, stress, they've got anxiety, they've got some trauma, loss, grief, etc. So it's that, for me, the interesting thing is that people element. And then the intersection of people and technology is really that's my sweet spot.
There's definitely a mental element to cybersecurity these days with like just the risk and fear associated for businesses and people responsible, right?
Yeah, risk and fear. And there's always been the element, when you look at something like phishing or whaling sort of attacks, it plays on, the psychology aspect of humans. And as humans, we're in, if you look at from how we've evolved and from an anthropological perspective, our tribal nature, our need to connect, our need to trust. Well, that's what cyber criminals play on, right? And that's how they're so successful in terms of getting people to click on things. It's funny, and I don't mean to digress, but I reckon like most of our security problems will be solved if people would just stop clicking on links or downloading files, etc. But we have spent billions of dollars on things like cyber education. I just don't think it's going to be solved. We can delve into it later in terms of my theories around that. Yep. But yeah, so I've got that technology, I've got the people aspect to it. And I think with the way technology is going, ask me 10 years ago, I would have said, it's got a bit to go and, it'll be somewhat fun in terms of the next 10, 20 odd years. But, with the advent of AI, with, Chat GPT, it's made me sort of reassess that and go, wow, okay, where I thought we were going to be in 15, maybe 20 years, you could probably condense down potentially 5. We'll see, but It's going to be a pretty exciting ride nonetheless.
Yeah, it's quite exciting. I want to touch on that in a second, but before we get there, do you want to explain in your words what emerging technologies is for our audience?
Yeah. It used to be called, cybersecurity as a discipline used to be called, when I first started, was PC security, because there was only really Microsoft desktops, then became computer security, data security, information security. Now we're at cybersecurity. Emerging tech is similar, right? It used to be called high tech. When I was working at Cisco and Intel, it was high tech. Anything that was outside of the ordinary, anything that was on the cutting edge, IoT, AI, that wasn't sort of mainstream operational sort of systems, was tagged with emerging tech. So it's a bit of an umbrella and catch-all.
Yep.
Yeah, but I usually classify as anything that's sort of outside of the mainstream that's being deployed, managed, etc.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, let's jump into what you're doing now at Azcende, Lani.
Yeah. So we started Azcende about 2 years ago. and Azcende is a venture capital firm. So we've stood up a fund, and the point of differentiation with Azcende is that the fund mandate or fund thesis is all around national security and critical infrastructure. So we don't do fintech, we don't do buy now pay later, we don't do crypto, definitely don't do crypto, etc. We looked at how technology could be most impactful to humans, and we picked a thesis that we thought was different in the market, but would be impactful, which is national security and critical infrastructure. So we look for startups that can be used dual purpose, with a national security context, as well as critical infrastructure and everyday life. So we just felt that was the most impactful for society, impactful for humans. And there are some great businesses, in terms of Australian startups that are actually looking to configure here for the overseas markets. They're fantastic.
So how do you help you identify businesses or startups in that field? Then what do you do for them?
So it's the startups that we normally engage have a pretty good idea around their tech. They're usually, so we're early stage, right? So we're seed to Series A. So they will had to have had an idea, an MVP either that's almost there, a minimal viable product, or already have an MVP and sort of pushing it into the market. So we can help them with that final stage of product fit, market fit, development, etc. But most of, I would say 90% of the startups that we talk to, the help that we'd give them is more from that market perspective. A lot of, let's say, cyber startups, they built their startups for, the general market, and we go, well, have you considered national security as well as critical infrastructure? And usually, 8 times out of 10, they'll be like, well, no, not really, because we don't have any experience in that. We hear that defense is hard to engage with, etc. So we help them build for that particular market, and also build for the US market. Nearly every single startup I've come across is dreams of one day entering the US market. So we've got a partner in the US. We've got a firm stood up there as well. Networks there to help them sort of configure here for the US market, rather than build a business here in Australia. Hey, we're going to the US. Oh, we've got to reconfigure our business, market fit, etc.
Yeah, that is exciting. 'Cause when we hear of like Atlassian, who crazy 2 Aussies going and doing a lot, but you don't hear a lot of other Aussie tech startups that actually go over the US and do really well. So that's interesting. All right, let's pivot a little bit to AI and Chat GPT. And everyone's talking about it right now. In your words, Lani, what is Chat GPT?
Well, look, in the most simplest term, it's a chatbot, right? And if you're a customer at a bank or with Telstra or whatever, you'll have had experiences with their like I'll talk to the Telstra one.
Yep.
The app, there's a chatbot. You log onto the app, you want to talk to somebody. You have a really rudimentary chatbot that will ask you, to basically direct your call. So, in the simplest sense, Chat GPT is a glorified chatbot. It's probably the best I've ever seen, like by far. And the language model, the data that it has access to is enormous. And it's a chatbot using natural language processing that's really conversant in terms of human engagement. Like I would say that it would be close to passing the Turing test in terms of being able to actually tell whether it's a human you're interacting with. And it's written in text at the moment, but eventually it'll be put into, audio in terms of voice, something like Siri or Alexa, etc.
Quite scary. It is exciting though. I've had to play around, and even just like marketing copy, for example, it can save you ages trying to come up with something. You just ask the question, has everything.
What people tend to focus on is Chat GPT itself, but if you look at it, it's one potential use case from an AI perspective. There could be many, right? And it's a fantastic use case, right? It's in beta at the moment. It's version 4 is due out, I think, in a few months, which supposedly is going to be much more powerful, 10 times more powerful than what it is already. And you're right. At the moment, it's complementary. You can use it to complement and supplement what you do. I've been using it since version 2, and version 3.5 is so much better, so much more powerful. Writing proposals, writing reports. Sometimes I'll be writing a report, and I'll get writer's block, and I'll be like, I've got to fill this with a little bit more. And it's like, hey, Chat GPT, give me some content to write. I'm doing this, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, that's exciting. So, what have you seen any realistic use cases of Chat GPT being used in Australian businesses yet?
Not in Australia. I mean, it was only released last year, November, December timeframe. I know a lot of people who I talk to are using it already. Marketing, copywriters, etc., are using it as a supplement.
Yep.
If you've used it, I don't know if you notice it, but if there's something that you're knowledgeable about, the actual content is fairly bland. Like it's not really in depth. It's fairly generic. Like I've asked it a number of cybersecurity questions, and the responses are really cookie cutter, right? And it's not something you could actually look at and go, oh yeah, I'll take that and implement it immediately. But it's pretty good for what it is. And I'll give you, there's one sort of edge use case, and this is in the psychology field, mental health field, right? So I've always been interested, as I said, the intersection of people and technology. And in terms of mental health, some of the challenges that we have is that it's not available to everyone because it can be expensive, right? To see a psychologist or a therapist, $150 an hour kind of thing. So, and you usually need multiple sessions. It's not just one session you go there and, hey, I'm well. It's usually, ideally between 3 to 5 sessions minimum, right? So that's a bit of an investment. And there's government programs you can access, but that's one of the challenges. The second challenge is that regional areas don't have access to good therapists. Right, because they have challenges already with doctors and nurses, etc. So I've always been interested in terms of how we can deliver it over video, how we can pre-screen or triage people using chatbots. Right, so I had this over Christmas, had a bit of time on my hands, so I had these conversations with Chat GPT. One of them went for an hour and a half, and I thought, you know what, how is this going to help mental health professionals to do those, make it freely available for everyone. Support remote areas. So I started this conversation, and it started with, "Hey, Chat GPT, I'm feeling really depressed. My mother has cancer," and that was the simple prompt. And it started with, it started a conversation. The first one went about an hour and a half, and I've got to say, as a therapist, the responses that came back had empathy. So I was like, oh, it understands, and it even threw back some interventions in the therapy spaces when the therapist says, try this, or intervenes to try and make a change or a shift in the session or in your thinking. And even some of the interventions that it had was vanilla in terms of, it's textbook.
Yeah.
But, for a something that's in beta at the moment, version 3.5, you could almost see that in 3 to 5 years, this thing, once you merge it with voice like Siri or Alexa, it will actually help achieve better mental health outcomes. So that merging of people and tech. So that's one use case.
Yep.
A bit of an edge use case, but I was like, wow.
Yeah, that's really impressive. I'm excited to see where that goes. And I actually did see a video of a managed IT provider who was integrating into Teams, a little connector into Chat GPT and trying to do that level 1 help desk within Teams. So he asked a quick question around how do I reset this password or how do I uninstall this application. It just gives you back the response like that, which is not something we've tried yet, but who knows where that's going to go.
Yeah,
And
I even saw, and the brilliant thing about it is that already there's startups that are being built around who provide service wrappers around ChatGPT. Like there's one I saw online last night as I was doing a bit of prep. It's called Do Not Pay. And it basically helps you write letters back to, if you got a parking ticket, a traffic fine, etc. It helps you, and I think I've got a success rate of something like 70% at the moment. So that's really, really good. And, even menial things, right? So I like to prep for a podcast, right? So I was like, earlier this week, I was like, hey, ChatGPT, I'm a guest on a podcast that's going to be talking about these things.
Yep.
How should I prepare? And it basically, how should I prepare talking about AI and yourself, ChatGPT in general?
Yeah.
And it spat out these 5 things. I was like, that's great. Like it would have taken me about half an hour to come up with these, things to prepare for.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And one thing that I did see as well, which you probably surely have seen this one as well, is like people doing malware, for example, and ransomware as a service, actually using AI to create scripts and asking it, how can I social engineer this person better, and how can I get into this environment? And that's actually scary.
It is, and again, right, it's one of those things with technology that it's you can use it for good and you can use it for evil or bad as well. Yeah, you're right. I've tried it. It's because it learns as you go, and it remembers the conversation that you're having. Yep. Sometimes I'll get responses where it will allow me to write like a good phishing email, and I've even got it to say write a phishing email, because spam filters are good, right? So they're pretty good these days. So sometimes the spam that you think has spelling errors and grammatical errors are actually ways to evade spam filters. So I asked it, write me a phishing email, but tune it so it will, bypass, the best of the current available spam filters. I had to try about 3 times to ask it the same question in a different format, because the first time it came and said, ethically, blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, well, that's a good response.
Yeah.
But if you change the questions enough, or if you break the questions up enough, you can actually get the answer that you want, which is write me a great phishing email.
Yeah, and the sweet sauce with it that I can see as well is the ability to look back at the same conversation and alter it, so you can say things like, make this sound more genuine, make it sound like it's from someone in Australia, that kind of stuff, and it'll do it for you.
As a consultant, right, as you're writing, it's like, it'll spit out, let's say, 1,000 words, and then you can prompt it, write more about blah, 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 write more, write in the, I've even tried to say, write it in the style of a McKinsey consultant, and it will spit something out, and I'll say, write it in the, from an auditor's perspective, and it will spit something out completely different, but on task. So it's a brilliant tool, and when you think about where it is now to where it can be in the next 5 years, let's say,
it's coming out of nowhere and it's kind of exploding.
Well, they've been developing for a while. If you keep an eye, I'm not an AI researcher by any means, but I keep an eye on emerging tech. So they were founded in 2015, so they've been there for a while as a lab. They're not they're what I call a quasi a not-for-profit. So they're a not-for-profit. They're called a capped for-profit, so they can accept invest. Microsoft have invested $1 billion already. Look like they're going to pour another $10 billion into it, primarily as Azure credits, but. So they've been around for a while. They were a bit of an altruistic answer to when Google acquired DeepMind. So Google acquired DeepMind in 2014. A bunch of people got together and thought, "Hey, this is too powerful to be in one company's one tech company's remit. So let's create an open source alternative in terms of research." And if you look at the people who founded, Sam Altman from Y Combinator. Elon Musk needs no introduction. Peter Thiel, Palantir and PayPal. Reid Hoffman, LinkedIn. So they had some really, sort of fantastic Silicon Valley type people. Yep. And it's just gone from there. So Model 2 was released about a year and a half ago. So as I said, I've been playing around with it since then.
But the reason it's gone public and more in the public eye and blown out recently is because of version 3 or 3.5, which actually is just open, so anyone can go and do it. Before it was kind of
well, it had. They said they reached 1 million users in 5 days, right?
Yeah.
If you look at it, Facebook took 10 months to get them to 1 million users. I think Instagram was like 2.5 months. So I haven't seen the numbers, but it's been pretty quick. And everyone I talk to who even dabbles in tech, teachers, have tried it and have used it, etc.
Yeah, well, the next podcast we've got actually in this studio later this week is with the head of IT at a school in Brisbane. And he's going to talk about Chat GPT and AI future in education.
I'd be keen to hear that from a professional in education. And from a pedagogical, sort of educational perspective.
I'll send you a link when it's outlined.
Yeah, it'll be good to hear because I think that's going to be the first industry that's going to be really disrupted by something like Chat GPT.
I think so. Nigel, have you checked out Chat GPT and AI or anything like that?
Yeah, look, it's going to be, as you said, a platform, right? So I see more emerging economies and new industries and new business, leveraging this platform to help, humans do more.
Yeah. And that and people often will ask, hey, is this going to do, which jobs are going to be displaced? By things like Chat GPT.
That's what I was going to ask next, actually.
Oh, okay.
So I'm curious on I guess your what's the actual impact and what's going to be I guess automated, or what's AI going to, and Chat GPT in particular, going to cut out from a jobs perspective in Australia first.
Yeah. What I find, before I answer that, what I find interesting is about when I was at Cisco, this is going back 6 or 7 years ago, we were talking to traditional industries, trucking, manufacturing, etc., about their blue-collar workers being displaced by automation, robotics, etc. And the catch cry back then was learn to code, right? Teach your people how to code about technology. Now, with ChatGPT, who can do rudimentary sort of programming, and you can see, within the next 5 years, the disruption coming in software development. Now, what do you teach them, right? I think the latest one is teach them to be an entrepreneur, right? Build a business. But look, I think in the short term, and again, right, the timeline's good depending on how quickly this thing develops. I think within the short frame, 3 to 5 years, I think you're going to see a lot of not disruption as such. I think what's going to happen is complementary, or it becomes complementary or supplementary to content creation, to copywriters, to etc. Marketing. So it's going to complement them and help them make their jobs easier. Potentially it will, the need to have so many of these workers may reduce in numbers, but it's you don't have to be a rocket science to see that within 3 to 5 years, it'll probably be automated and well-trained, and the data sets they use won't be so generic. So they'll be able to build up, I don't know, like legal data sets, real estate data sets, etc.
Because everything in the database now, Lani, correct me if I'm wrong, is up until mid-2021. There's nothing more.
But it's generic, right? It's built as a generic data model. Yep. So it doesn't specialize in anything in particular. Yep. But that's the next step, right? To build smaller data models of it. So when you ask it questions, it can point to that particular data model rather than answering it from its sort of general knowledge perspective.
Yeah. So in your thoughts, Lani, I've been in like emerging technologies for 25 years now. You're in a good spot in Australia to have input on this. You think that like coding is something that can be really supplemented by AI and Chat GPT, and then marketing, content creation. Anything else you think that's going to be
education?
effective?
I think education, particularly around how. And I'm not an educator, right? But particularly around how they assess, because the first cab off the rank is writing essays, theses, etc. using it. So I think those three industries will be supplemented at first, disrupted. So people in it will need to either do it, add more skills or add more points of differentiation, and then the third step will be displacement. So it'll be 5 to 10 years. You'll probably see displacement. In terms of people having to retrain, reskill to do something else.
Yeah, it's because it's gonna be so different. I'll give a realistic use case. Actually, it was quite funny. My sister-in-law, she's a zookeeper, and she was saying, "Oh no, it's not going to change what I do. There's no way." And then I'm like, "Okay, well, what's something you've written before?" She's like, "Oh, well, we always write guides on how to build a nutrition plan, for example, for a kangaroo." And I put that in Chat GPT, and it's like this big and exactly. Oh, she's like, "Wow, that's actually very, very good." And I was like, and and then shortened to 100 words, shortened it for her, and she's like, "Oh damn." That's so good.
There are some industries that it won't disrupt, like barbers. People think, "Oh, you're just joking," but I'm like, yeah. If you look at hairdressing or barbering, it requires both human interaction, but the actual actions from a robotic perspective is going to be pretty hard to, in terms of dexterity, in terms of movement, in terms of. It's going to be pretty hard to disrupt within the next. What we know is happening in robotics within the next, I reckon, 20 years. But even things like blue collar jobs, like mechanics. Right, my son's finishing his apprenticeship this year, and I've been in his ear for so long. Hey, you should have gone to business school, or should have done your MBA, kind of thing. But talking him through what he does, and the complexity of car engines, and the different types of models, etc. Again, right, from a robotics perspective, AI will be able to disrupt it from a diagnosis. So you bring your car in, you'll literally be able to plug into a diagnostics port and go, "Hey, this is what's wrong, A, B, C, and D. You need to, fix, replace."
Yep.
But it's still going to have to be primarily done physically until we get to a stage where cars are fairly carbon copy templated, and robotics can, it's like a assembly line.
Yeah, see what Tesla does in that space, because you probably saw the drone walkthrough of like a Tesla Gigafactory, and how for robotics in that is pretty intense.
Yeah.
So
look, robotics is coming. It's still lagging.
Yep.
And I'll give you an example, right? So robotics, for a long time, I've been looking at robotics from interestingly enough, from an aged care perspective.
Okay.
So the challenge with aged care that we have at the moment is that there's simply not enough people in terms of care from a 1-to-1. Even a 1 to 4 or 5 in terms of. So a lot of the large aged care providers have been looking to tech to try and how can we solve this problem?
Fill gaps in labour shortage, right?
Looking ahead, 10, 15, 20 years or so. So I did a couple, when I was previously as a consultant, I did a couple of gigs looking 10, 20 years into the future for these organizations in terms of what personal assistance will look like. So from an AI perspective, Chat GPT, by the time you get into a Siri, Alexa type interface, and they tune the model, within about 5 years, great. You'll be conversant. But still, robotics what people tend from a robotics perspective, if you're looking for a personal helper or a personal carer, what people actually connect to are the facial features. And if you look at the human face, there are, hundreds of muscles in your actual face. And each time it changes and shifts in contrast to another muscle, it depicts emotion, empathy, etc. So that's where I think robotics still has a way to go. The fine motor skills, etc. If you look at the Boston Dynamics stuff, from a military perspective, you can definitely see it within the next 10 years. But from a personal assistant kind of thing, it's still got a ways to go to catch up to where we are with the AI at the moment.
Yeah, I can imagine it's going to be a while, because I know like in the tech in aged care, like cameras and fallover sensors, that kind of stuff's already there, but
it's already there.
Robotics might be a while.
Like WARN sensors, Apple Watch type sensors, LoRaWAN sensors, so dementia patients, if they get out and they're roaming the streets or whatever, it can be easily identified. That kind of tech, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's pivot a little bit into more cybersecurity, another area you're passionate about. Nigel, do you want to lead in with a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure, Jackson. So look, it's interesting listening to the conversation. It's all about adaptability, right? So and I think Lani, something that I'll pay you massive respect for is when cybersecurity, if you want to have a subject matter expert, it's always been you, right? So I really appreciate you coming in, but. In terms of adaptability, in terms of AI, I've known you for about a decade now, and what you've come from to where we're going.
Yeah.
What can you share from a cyber point of view in terms of thoughts, ideas, like where the world is going? Given that we've got this new platform, like I see the AI as really an enabler to let humans achieve more.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Look, you're right. Look, 25 years has taught me, and cyber has taught me that a lot of things change. Technology. Some things don't change. The motives of cyber criminals to do what they do, right? They do it for profit. Nation state actors do it because they want a geopolitical advantage over other countries, etc. So that aspect of cyber hasn't changed. Probably never will, but the technology definitely. If you look at techniques, tactics, processes of adversaries of hackers, again, it's a lot of it has stayed the same. A lot of it has changed. I think what has changed the most, particularly here in Australia, you could talk more broad globally, but here in particular in Australia, we've been fairly slow to adopt, to spend, to resource cybersecurity programs. I'm talking about individual organisations, even from a governmental perspective, for a long, long time. Like I remember talking to boards even 10 years ago, right? So I used to run these workshops called Black Swan workshops for boards. So they look at their risk register and they go, what are some of the risks that we're just not seeing? Something that will happen like COVID, right? Something that we just didn't outside of our standard sort of risk processes. So run those workshops to make them more aware of what could be coming. What are you not looking at? And then you look at it and go, okay, well, is it one power organization we looked at wanted to start to workshop what it would be like if this is going back 10 years ago, if terrorists sort of sailed a ship into Brisbane port and blew it up, kind of thing. It's like, yeah, okay, you want to look at that? Let's workshop that. So I used to run these Black Swan workshops, and up until about 5 years ago in critical infrastructure, still boards were like, yeah, a cyber attack on our ability to provide clean water or our ability to generate power. Yeah, that's Black Swan, right? Won't happen. And it's like, are you sure that's like, given where we are you sure that that's the case? Yeah, the ability of someone to directly target our operational technology systems, way out there. And then what happened, right, is they're right. Like it's very rare for someone to actually attack a power plant directly in terms of their operational technology. But what's happened is that ransomware on the IT side, which is dime a dozen, right, has now started to impact their critical infrastructure, because we're now, as you guys would know, we're now sort of converging operational technology with IT, with cloud, etc. So it's like, no one's going to attack you directly in terms of how you generate power and how do you clean water, but it's going to come through your standard, IT systems. So I think the awareness of that we've finally gotten to the stage where I say that the long holiday Australia has had when it comes to cyber is over, right? Cyber criminals know that we're vulnerable because we're less mature. Processes are, we're just not as vigilant as they are in the US and the UK. So you're seeing a lot more breaches. Optus, Medibank, last year.
A follow-up question I got from that question for you is that there has been so much innovation from bad actors and threat actors across the globe. If you look at the phishing emails throughout, even 5 years ago, it was broken English, it was shocking. And then now you've got like sophisticated social engineering, people bypassing MFA, like it's evolved so crazy.
Well, you can use Chat GPT now.
Exactly. Can cybersecurity in Australia keep up with that?
Yeah. Look, we don't lack tools, right? And I think we spoke about this earlier. We don't lack, and I said this about 5 years ago, and it was really unpopular. I said we don't lack the technology and the tools, right? We've got oodles of choice, etc. In terms of vendors, even in terms of security providers. It's not that. It's the ability to actually integrate that into your organization, into your organization's technology sort of processes, but even into your organizational culture as well. That's an important point, because I'll give you a short example, right? So I won't name who the client is, or the firm I was working for, but we were doing a privilege access management deployment at a very large healthcare organization, one of the largest in Australia. And so this PAM, I'll call it, this PAM implementation was essentially to reduce the what doctors and nurses had access to on their machines in terms of their user rights. They're used to having local admin rights. They can do anything they want, right? Trouble with that is, malware once, or ransomware, whatever it is, once it gets on your machine, it takes those privileges and then does whatever it wants. So the first step was, we're actually going to restrict it to give you only user rights. So you can use your machine, but you can't do much else. The project, it was a $8 to $9 million project over 3 years, fell over at that first hurdle. Because doctors and nurses said, we're not going to do this. Administrators who'd been working in development there for 15 years and who had access to these tools, they said, we're not going to do it. We're simply not going to give up those rights, right? So from a cultural perspective, there's always going to be challenges adopting new technology, but the tech definitely is out there.
Hopefully, the big, massive breaches that happened recently have kind of changed that mentality a little bit for people.
I think it will, and the reason why people have said, but there's been breaches overseas for years. Like we've been talking about, there's a particular breach that there's been a bit of a use case. The Target breach happened in like 2003, right, 2004 timeframe. So people say, well, what's going to change this time? And I think what's different is that if you looked at just the two Optus and Medibank breaches, they were so large and they affected actually people, you and I, etc. There was a Woolies breach as well around their My Deal. And I've talked to a number of people who hit the trifecta, right? They were a customer of all three. So I think that's going to change the mentality of boards, of executives who have already been under scrutiny, either from ASIC, who's the regulator, or APRA, or the AEMO, who's the energy regulator. So there's pressure coming from regulators from a compliance and regulatory perspective, the stick approach.
Yep.
And then there's obviously pressure coming from adversaries, threat actors, etc. So I think using those two approaches, I think you will see change. First of all, at the public sector, large end of town, but it will definitely flow through, because one of the big themes of 2023 will be supply chain or third-party risk.
Yep.
So a lot of these organizations are going to go, wow, the regulator's asking me to do all these things. It's going to cost me so much money to do it. All my suppliers, I'm just going to pass that risk onto them and get them to meet, their sort of obligations under it, which reduces my risk and reduces the cost to me. That's
definitely, I think, what's next this year. It's big for large companies, because Telstra had a little scare because that was like an API with a third-party contractor.
Yeah.
When their internal employees benefits package or something just got released, and a lot of employees got that data got breached. So I think that people like supply chain connected to you that have data sharing are a big threat, as well as looking at the people who just supply stuff to you in general.
Yeah. I mean, I'm doing some work for a smaller 100-person company at the moment, and they have customers who are very large in transport, etc. And so what they're starting to see now in their contracts that they have to adhere to as they're being renewed is that you need to be ISO 27001 certified. Now that's a huge program, right, for a 100-person organization. So that then becomes a point of contention for them. It's like, do we spend the millions of dollars it's going to take to build an ISMS, or how are we going to do this? Because one customer may ask for it, but that it's going to be stock standard across the board. Mm-hmm. So in 2023, larger organizations are going to start pushing that down to smaller ones in their supply chain, which is you need to comply to NIST, you need to comply to ISM, you need to, which it's cost for a business.
And just on that, Lani, what is your advice to a business owner that I guess is aware they need to do something? And we're talking about, the probably the owner-led businesses.
Yes.
How do they get match fit from a cyber point of view?
Yeah. It's be proactive, right? The worst thing you can do is wait till either A, you have a breach, or B, it comes down in a contract that you have to meet certain cyber contractual obligations that you can't. Because these things, like a ISO 27001 seems to be popular. If it's American companies, it's usually around the NIST framework. But ISO 27001, to build a proper, auditable, certified ISMS, which is Information Security Management System, runs into the millions of dollars, right? Because it's people, process, and then technology as well in terms of controls. So get on it especially for business owners who, I know I work with a lot of them. A lot of them are very conscious of budgets, conscious of cash flow, capital, etc. But you need to see cyber as an existential risk, just a business risk to you. Get on the front foot, get someone in like yourselves to assess where you are in terms of your position, and then map out a remediation program. These programs don't get done in months, right? They're usually 2 to 3 years to build them.
It's interesting, and that's something that back to what I said before, like that kind of cost does kind of need to be passed on to, if you put in inflation into perspective, plus the cost of getting 27,001, what that would do to your average kind of cost to other businesses. You have to raise a fair amount. But something I will say is that even though it's almost a recession overseas and things, Australian businesses aren't really always going, especially with technology, for the cheapest option. So it kind of allows for that a little bit, I would say, as well. Nigel, do you have any other questions before we start to wrap up?
Well, it's interesting. Like you talk about the VC fund and technology and all that. As a Brisbane boy, what's your take on the Brisbane scene from a tech point of view? And you've done a lot with the US and everything. I'm keen to understand. I love Brisbane and live here, and as you do, Lani. So
look, Brisbane as part of the national ecosystem is probably the third wheel. You've got Sydney and Melbourne, definitely the powerhouses from an Australian perspective. Brisbane does have a sort of unique sort of boutique startup culture. I mean, we're lucky that people like Steve Baxter, back in the Riverside Labs days, started early, right? And he sort of really cemented that sort of scene. RCL is still here, with the Australian Computer Society owning it, but that sort of started off a bit of a startup culture around Australian startups here in Brisbane. So there's a few of them, but primarily most of them are in that fintech, crypto, type space. We're trying to encourage, and at Azcende, we're trying to encourage veterans in particular. So those who have served in the Australian Defence Force, they come out. People think, veterans come out and they're programmed to think a certain way. Yeah, they've got hierarchy and chain of command built in. But actually, if you talk to them about what they did in their day-to-day jobs, whether they've been deployed or whatever it is, they had to actually come up with pretty unique sort of ways to get the job done within their unit, so to speak. So a lot of them come up with fantastic ideas around how procurement could be improved in defence, or how certain things can be done. So it's really about creating that new ecosystem, tapping into it. So we love the fact the national security sort of thesis, because I think that's the area for growth for Australia, and starting to export some of our startup tech. Given that we have all these geopolitical pressures in Ukraine and potential conflict coming with China, etc., it's a good space to be in terms of it's a resilient thesis, but it'll return the same type of returns that investors are looking for.
Fantastic.
So exciting space to be.
So what's next for Lani Refiti?
Oh, look, I think at the moment I had 10 years ago I had all these boxes to tick in terms of career. Big vendor experience, tick. Partner in the Big Four, tick. And VC was my last one. So I'm hoping this is it. It's such an exciting space for someone who's got a background in tech like myself. I really had to teach myself investment, basics, etc. So that's learning something new is probably for me the exciting bit. So that's probably what you'll see from me in the next decade is around that venture. Always, cyber's always going to be there because that's what I've been doing forever. But in the venture capital space. Exciting.
I was keen to see where how that goes. Mate, thanks for coming. Really appreciate it. You've said some good insights around Chat GPT and AI and cybersecurity, and you're generally an expert in the Brisbane area for in IT, cyber and emerging technologies. So I really appreciate it, Lani.
Awesome. Really enjoyed the conversation, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Lani.